Hi guys, this is Adnan,
This is Tanzala.
and a happy new year to everyone out there. We hope you're keeping well and that you're super excited for what we hope will be a slightly better year than the one that just went by.
This one is going to be us taking you through a few of our favorite things of 2020. One thing that definitely helped when we were in isolation is the books that got us through. This one over here, he read around 38 books last year, and I read around 10, but that's more than I had read years before. So that was definitely something that was very welcome, and I think I'll definitely carry my love for books and the passion of that throughout the years to come. So without further ado,
So the first one we have is The Silk Roads by Peter Frankopan, and it's a very gripping retelling of history as we know it. It kind of turns certain commonly held myths and assumptions on its head, and it really forces you to redefine your thinking around history, or popular tropes around history.
I think what Peter Frankopan, the myth that he tries to debunk is this myth that we've been taught in our, history classes, in our textbooks and so forth, that has a very Eurocentric view of history as we know it, and places Rome, Greece, Northern Europe at the forefront of history, and sends Asia to kind of the sidelines, and doesn't show that it was relevant years ago. Whereas in reality, it was the Asia and the Middle East and so forth was a cradle of our civilization, and they were actually one of the wealthiest nations in the ancient times. So he kind of takes us through the history from the perspective of Middle East and Asia, and more so talks about history, and he covers it from ancient Greece to present world today, and he focuses on the Silk Roads to kind of illustrate the story. For those of you guys who don't know what Silk Roads are, they were the trade routes that forged around connecting the east to the west. And it's where goods flowed. So for example, like silk from China to Europe, and gold and silver the other way around.
So I think one thing that he strongly debunks in this book, and I think it's a commonly held narrative, is that the Silk Road was not like an actual formed, constructed road connecting China in the east to, all the way through Central Asia and the Mediterranean to the Roman Empire in the west. It was basically just a series of, travel routes and caravan routes that, kind of interlinked along the way. And it collectively gave rise to this notion of a Silk Road. That's the best way that I can explain it, at least in layman's terms. It was just fortuitous that these routes and roads, they just happened to kind of crisscross and overlap with each other. And so, you had immensely valuable commodities such as silk flowing out from China headed westward towards the Middle East and beyond to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and eastwards you had other valuables flowing such as fur and so on, and of course it was a transitory route for a lot of commodities such as spices, frankincense, myrrh. That's essentially what the book encapsulates. And what's funny is that it's kind of come full circle now, right? And Peter Frankopan actually ends the book on that note.
Yes.
He, through a series of illustrative examples, he kind of showcases how the center of economic gravity in the world is now shifting eastwards. In fact,
Has been for a while.
It has been for a while. I would not say it's now shifting eastwards. I mean, analysts and economists have predicted, according to numerous studies and reports, that by 2028, China will be the biggest economy in the world. And it's already headed that way. It's not just China, but you also have a lot of emerging economies such as Vietnam, Indonesia, and then countries that kind of occupy that middle ground between, established, developed countries and emerging powers such as India, which is a bit higher up than the latter, but not exactly at China's level. And then of course you have numerous countries in Africa which are rising rapidly, developing at an amazing rate actually, and encouraging even more investment. So Peter Frankopan, from a top level view, he comments on
Those things,
that.
and I think it's not often that a book makes me question my perception about a lot of things and beliefs that I hold as fact. And I think this book does a really good job of doing that. And I think every other page I was like, wait, is that true? Like, that really happened? So there's a lot of untold parts of history in there, were uncommon for us, at least. And I think one of the biggest takeaways from it also was just, even 500 years ago, like, the rise of Western civilization was always so that they could gain entry into, like, the Eurasian trading routes. I think that's, like, one of the biggest takeaways is they were always looking to do business with the East, and they were competing against each other all the time, so that they could steal the business of these, wealthy Eastern countries. But yeah, if you're somebody who is interested in that, or somebody who wants to, like, hear a little bit of a different version of history, I think we both, like, recommend this book wholeheartedly.
It's a very gripping commentary on what's going on in the world right now, and it kind of presages what is yet to come. I mean, the center of economic gravity in the world is going to be even further entrenched in the East in the years to come. We are, in a way, kind of in a way, we are kind of witnessing the decline of, Europe and North America. Still very strong economies, still very strong blocks, but they're not what they once were. And many of these markets, as you know, are quite saturated already. And you're seeing, hundreds of millions of people in the East getting further empowered, getting further enriched, many more entering the middle class. And, Peter Frankopan, he kind of, he moves away from this Eurocentric definition of history that has pervaded our curriculum and, popular imagination for years on end. He doesn't hesitate to take the claws out on, even popular figures such as, and I would say controversial figures such as Columbus and Cortez, and kind of showing how, certain mishaps in history have contributed to the fall of once glorious civilizations, such as the Incas, the Aztecs, the Mughals in India, the various dynasties in China, civilizations that were flourishing for centuries upon end, but then a chance encounter with certain people or certain other rival civilizations which weren't necessarily doing as well. I mean, Spain and Portugal during the time of, Cortez and Columbus. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, compared to these other civilizations, they were considered backwaters. And yet, what happened in hindsight, right? So I think that was one thing that, in a way, I kind of knew about it already, but just seeing that, shoved in your face.
Just
bluntly.
him highlighting everything so well and taking us through the entire story from Columbus to Hernan Cortez to the different stories, even in the ship where people were thrown overboard, or just hearing those stories of the less glamorous parts of human history as well. Yeah,
which continue to haunt us to this day, and obviously we've seen a reckoning over that. Not just in 2020, but way beyond 2020 as well. But the provenance of the transatlantic slave trade and bringing back certain delicacies and exotic tribal elders from the New World for the king and queen of Spain. So the book is really eye-opening in that regard, and it is an international bestseller at this point. I had the chance to see Peter Frankopan and briefly meet him during a session at the Emirates Lit Fest in Dubai a few years ago. So it's been on my list for a while, and Tans and I absolutely love this book, and we definitely recommend it.
I think this is probably my favorite book of 2020.
Really?
I think so. Of 2020, I really think so.
I believe another one's coming up, isn't it?
In terms of changing my perspective, I would definitely say it's like great. Kind of in the similar line of the Silk Roads comes another book from a historian, and he's an Israeli historian. His name is Yuval Noah Harari, and his book is called Sapiens. Yuval Noah Harari tries to take on the Herculean task of explaining all of human history in one book.
In the span of slightly under 500 pages. All of human existence.
All of human existence.
Yeah, so that's roughly 200,000 BC to the present.
To the present, exactly. And so from the first people, humans to walk on Earth, all the way through the different revolutions that we faced. So moving from the cognitive to the agricultural to the scientific revolution. And he uses, I think, anthropology, paleontology, and biology to kind of describe and give certain examples from all those disciplines, as well as economics as well. And I think yeah, I think one of the largest takeaways from this book was when he spoke about the cognitive revolution. And he said that we don't really know why humans evolved to have this new cognitive ability. Right now, in terms of science, it's just due to chance. But what he stated is that is the cornerstone of what led to our success in building the communities and kind of fighting off and surviving against species that were perhaps stronger, quicker, and more adapted to the environment than us. And so basically our cognitive ability was the way to story tell, right? So our ability to tell stories and interpret them, and then also eventually to read and write stories. So he says that's been the cornerstone of our success as humans. And the way he kind of explains that is that he talks about the rule of building communities, right? The fact that we've been able to break away from smaller units to bigger collective societies is because we share a shared vision or a shared mission, and we can all connect to that even though we may be far away from that one person who's leading that organization. And what was really interesting beyond that, and this is something that I still think about sometimes when reading his book and further away just going through my life, and I'm not 100% sure how I feel about this, so perhaps you can like comment on it as well, is this concept of like myths and the story aspect of it. So Yuval Harari kind of argues that everything that we have, example like religion, nations, human rights, marriages, corporations, money is all a myth, and it's a figment of our imagination. And the day that we stop believing in it is the day they cease to be an actual thing. So he kind of talks about that. I don't know where you feel about that, but I think that's like one that like kind of stood out to me.
It's funny. The minute you said that, I started thinking about American Gods by Neil Gaiman, and the premise of American Gods is it's basically a showcase of all these gods such as Odin and Shiva and so on, and how they've been reduced to almost nothing more than mere mortals at this point because people have stopped believing in them. So when people stop believing in those gods, their power actually gets stripped away. Now that belief has shifted to celebrities, influencers, and media, and they represent the new gods, whereas the old gods are the Odins and again the Shivas and these old Norse gods and Egyptian gods like Horus and Ra and so on, the Queen of Sheba, etc.
Think about it like bitcoins, right? We're giving it power because we're investing in it.
Valuation, exactly. No, but I completely agree. I mean, I think to a large extent, I mean, if you talk about like myth and religion, I would to a great extent agree with him. I mean, these are largely,
I do understand.
People might differ, but they're largely human constructs, right? No matter which creed or faith you might hail from. I'm not talking about the spiritual realm. I'm not talking about your connection to whatever like you might feel. But I'm talking about like theology. I'm talking about theology as opposed to faith. So I can see his point of view on that. I may or may not agree with everything, but I can see where he's coming from. And to your point about communities, one thing I found interesting about the book was like he pointed out, he was basically articulating a theory that I think a lot of researchers and historians have articulated before him about the fall of the Neanderthals. And the reason being that Homo sapiens, hence, the title of the book, Sapiens, Homo sapiens possess this uncanny ability to organize themselves into communities and groups better than any other subspecies of humankind at that point. So that's one of the reasons that's been postulated behind the demise of Neanderthals. One is, intermarriage and, interbreeding with Homo sapiens. But the other one is it's also possible that Homo sapiens basically out-grouped, outmaneuvered, out-thought, out-fought Neanderthals, right? Like, if you have like even a fairly large group of Neanderthals would amount to nothing more than a few dozen. Well, what happens when they encounter a few hundred Homo sapiens migrating from another area? Just the ability to like share stories, be cohesive, act as part of a group or a tribe or any kind of coalition.
It's that creation of us. right?
Us versus them, the like othering. You can say that's probably
That's
the origins of othering.
and I think we've also kind of evolved to carry that with us.
Yeah.
In terms of
Yeah, it's definitely reverberated like
unfortunately
over
another
the millennia.
right,
For sure. Yeah, exactly. Humans are still, prone to
Mm-hmm.
that kind of base thinking even right now. And one line that really jumped out at me from the book was, Yuval Noah Harari says that during, I forgot which period in history he was referring to, but it was something in prehistory. He said every waking second was a moment in Darwinism. You were basically fighting for survival every waking moment, because this was a moment in time when something as simple as getting a scratch could mean your death.
Mm-hmm.
Or, getting mauled by a wild animal. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, we had a lot more species on the planet that that have actually been fictionalized in popular culture at this point, right? So you would either be trampled by an animal or mauled to death by an animal, or you'd get a cut and, that would lead to some kind of poisoning internally and you couldn't treat it. So he said that if you weren't careful, you'd be pushing up daisies in no time. And that's basically, a lesson in Darwinism. Obviously, life is so safe and secure and comfortable right now. You have access to all the modern amenities and everything that healthcare has to offer. But, like 50,000 years ago, even 10,000 years ago, even 1,000 years ago, you were vulnerable to pretty much anything out there. So that's something that really, jumped out at me. And being like, so thankful that, we live in an era like we are right now.
We're very cushy. And I think that's one of his points as well, because I think there's a lot of doom and gloom in our society that, there's so much hardships happening in the world, so many, tiny wars happening, and the depression and the recessions and so forth. And people assume that this is the worst point in human history. And Yuval Noah Harari kind of makes us, take a step back and say, no, this is actually one of the happiest times in human history. And the poorest people and nations are living better than the richest did, centuries ago. So, so he kind of makes that point as well. And he also talks about the Aztecs and the Incas as well, and that's also another theme between these two books that does not go amiss.
But both books are very they kind of tread like parallel paths in a way, although Sapiens goes further back into prehistory, and it delves into far greater detail in prehistory, and that's why, when I think about these two books, I kind of get confused about what I read in which one, because they overlap so much and they're so engaging. I mean, it's not just about the the content and the material that the authors, both celebrated professors in their own right, are working with, but it's the way they've written it. It's the style, it's the tone, it's the narrative, it's the structure. They're both very witty authors, I have to say.
So
they're
intelligent,
very edgy, witty, a bit funky. They make a lot of references to pop culture as well. Definitely a very different take on history.
He does say some controversial stuff in this book. Just one about the agricultural revolution being like the worst thing for mankind, and being, I think, a scam. I think that's what he refers to as. So I think that's the one part where it's a bit opinionated as opposed to fact-based. I think
there is a certain bit of editorializing in both books, I would say. Probably a bit more in Sapiens. But then again, both men, both scholars, I think they've also kind of gained that, right? It's very different from us editorializing.
Right.
We can't editorialize on that
that's
scale.
A fair point.
And I mean, the books are very well drawn, very well researched, very well laid out. And honestly, if more of my history textbooks at university were like this, I'd enjoy it a lot more.
Especially in high school, in grade 10, when I used to have the history classes, if my teachers gave me these books, maybe I would have read it. Instead of just...
better late than never. You read them now.
I read them now.
The next book that is on our list that Tanz and I really enjoyed is Catch and Kill, by the Pulitzer Prize-winning Ronan Farrow, obviously a celebrated journalist in his own right, formerly of NBC, son of Mia Farrow. And obviously a lot of you out there, you're probably familiar with the Harvey Weinstein situation and what transpired a few years ago. Horrible, horrible stuff. And that is in large part due to the work done by Ronan Farrow. Ronan Farrow and exceptional journalists like him who work tirelessly every day to uncover what's going on in our society.
From New York Times.
The New York Times, It's funny. Like, I've seen so many interviews with these journalists, with all three of them actually separately for their separate books, and I can't remember the name of those other two journalists because I've seen like so much coverage with them. But I think that's something I should also consider reading.
Yes,
at some
because they
point.
came out with another.
But for Catch and Kill, it's funny. For the longest time, I saw a lot of coverage around Ronan Farrow's work, and there was a controversy about the breaking of the story, and he did a lot of work promoting this book. He did a fantastic job, I would say, from a marketing and PR perspective, and I would say, obviously for a good cause, because I can't say this enough, more people need to read this book. Obviously, it's done very well. It's a bestseller. It's internationally known. But it really gives you some insight into what Ronan Farrow went through to kind of like get all the details needed to like carefully craft this book, put it together. It reads a lot like a novel.
Yes.
Honestly, you don't feel like you're
reads
reading.
Like a thriller.
It reads like a thriller. It is like a downright thriller. It does not read like a documentary or pseudo-documentary type narrative. It is very much almost like a novel. Like I read the book in the span of like 3 days. I thought it might take me a week or more because I was so gripped. Whenever I had like even 5 minutes free, I would just pick it up and start reading it. I take it out with me on walks. I'd read it during meals. Like it was just that enrapturing. And
I think one of the things it does, I think two things it does really well. I think first I think the first thing it does really well is how it describes in depth how important journalism is and the hard work that journalists go through in terms of like chasing the story, finding out the details, and then chasing leads, and finally getting a chance to meet with the leads and then convincing them to partake in their story and their piece at the detriment of perhaps their reputation, and going against like very, very powerful individuals and corporations and organizations, and at times at a threat to their life. And it further solidifies, I think,
being stalked and followed by agents,
Black
getting death notes. I mean, Harvey Weinstein, the most powerful man in Hollywood.
Can you imagine like going after the most powerful man and very well liked in Hollywood? Done favors for many people, so they do those back for him. And I think it further solidifies the belief that journalists are, the cornerstone of our democracy, and they really uphold our democracy and the freedom of information. So I think he described his like process really well, from him first uncovering the story and digging deeper to finding the sources and convincing them, and how they sometimes refuse to go on record, and you have to start the process all over again.
Or sometimes they go on record and then back out last minute because someone sent them a threatening note or something.
Exactly. So he really uncovers that messy structure of silencing stories, and even like the title Catch and Kill. What that is referring to is this notion in the industry which speaks about let's say there's a controversial thing that happened with a well-known individual. You find the sources that are currently reporting on it, and you pay to have that story, and then you just bury it. So you catch the story and you kill it. So you pay to have the rights of that story, and then just never let it see the light of day. And it just was illuminating to hear about like the different times that's occurred as well. And the book kind of talks a little bit about the different instances.
Yeah, it really pulls back the curtain on the behind-the-scenes dealings of what transpired at NBC and the New Yorker.
Yeah.
Basically, long story short, Ronan Farrow was shut down at NBC, his then employer, who were initially kind of okay with the story, it seemed, at least from the outset. And then he ended up having to break it at the New Yorker, which was unfortunate in terms of the whole NBC deal. Obviously, NBC has a much bigger platform. But he managed to get the story out anyway. And that's a lesson in perseverance and resilience, right? Like, if you don't succeed at one outlet, just go to another. If you are convinced that something is right and something needs to be told to people out there, you should do it.
And it was interesting that it was also like the heads of NBC, which are, a news broadcaster, and even they were a little too afraid.
Exactly. You're essentially double crossing the most powerful man in Hollywood,
and also your employer, right?
Yeah.
So it's just so admirable that Farrow took that step and took that leap and did it for the greater good of women in general, and all these, had a conscience, right? And he could have easily just let the story slide and gone on to be on good terms with NBC and see his career, perhaps go flourish with the NBC at other points, because he didn't know how this would turn out, right?
Exactly.
So I think that has to be one thing that's like very admirable for Ronan Farrow. And another reason, so the second thing I was mentioning was just regards to the stories of the women. He does describe it in the book, and it is a bit graphic, so there's like a trigger warning there as well, but it is just so important to hear those women's stories and what they went through, and I'm sure a lot of them are still in the woodworks and haven't come out with what's happened, but it's just really important to highlight those stories and really pay respect to those women, and just as a society, I think, figure out how to make this stop, or at least reduce it a lot more, because this isn't only in Hollywood. It's not specific to Hollywood. It parades every industry you can think of, colleges, universities,
pharmaceuticals,
jobs,
energy,
corporate
telecom.
roles. I don't know why my mom always has this like theory where she believes that like corporate roles and the corporate world is so much like cleaner and has no harassment as such. And
well, in a way, I guess. If you look at the women who are mentioned in Catch and Kill, whether it's Fox, whether it's Miramax Films, Harvey Weinstein's banner, they're all essentially working in corporate roles. And a lot of this stuff does happen in corporate roles. And you keep hearing about this in the news, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And to your point about, the importance of journalism and its status as a cornerstone of democracy, like at a time like right now, it could not ring more true. Look at the period of disinformation we're living in right now. Look at the backlash that news outlets, like respected news outlets, are bearing the brunt of right now. It's it's work like this, like the work that's outlined in Catch and Kill by people like Ronan Farrow, risking their lives, that really kind of validates what journalism is doing right now. And not just, uncovering the story behind Harvey Weinstein's scandal, but even, correspondents in war zones. They're putting their lives on the line. So many correspondents have been killed over the last few decades, covering all those conflicts and all these atrocities. And who knows how many other journalists have been silenced for so many other stories globally, right? So it really puts things into perspective. You read books like this and you look at the meticulous work that goes behind validating stories and verifying facts and getting people on record, having fact checkers and researchers to corroborate those facts. You realize, wow, this is not an easy industry to be in, actually.
And it takes a lot of intelligence, wits, bravery, courage. You have to kind of be like a complete package. Communication.
And sometimes that risks your life and that of your family. So, it's that high.
So definitely recommend this one.
Yeah.